Sorry about that. My little system here cut me off for some reason. So, I think all the technology right now is struggling to keep up with our current needs. But as I was saying, it'll be just interesting to see how all of this shakes out, in coming months, and comparisons that we can make, things we can learn from country to country. How different ones with different plans, handle the situation. I think there will be a great deal to learn from the varying methods that were used. And so, anyway, keep an eye on that, just for your own sake too, going forward. Keep an eye on British news and how they handle things, how they get back to normal life once all this passes. It'll be interesting. So last time we were wrapping up with the end of World War II. The world had been in a massive struggle for years and years and years. Britain had been on the front lines of it since the beginning, and had taken more of a beating than most countries. And so they, as a country, were ready for a change. The U.S. was ready for the war to be over, but you can imagine that even more so for those in the UK. And so one of the interesting things that came out of the war and the aftermath was that Churchill lost the very next election. That was a shocker. You would have assumed, you had these classic election posters, getting people to go vote, and Labour is pushing for, the Conservatives are pushing for it. And it's amazing because in May of 1945, Churchill had an 83% approval rating. That is just not fathomable by any modern politician to have that kind of approval. But coming out of the war, people, approved of the job that had been done. That they had faced incredible odds and beat those odds significantly. Most assumed that the Conservative Party would just ride to victory again because they had such high approval, and the country and a lot of the world that was connected to Britain was in deep shock over Churchill's loss. But why was that? Now, one of the things that Churchill had done, and that worked well for the war itself, was that he created a cross-political coalition. So getting all the parties involved. Labour, at the time it was Labour, Liberal, and Conservative. There were kind of three main parties there. And he put people from those parties in leadership positions. And so it was to keep the country, all of the country, on board with the project of winning the war. That was the key here. That was the only real goal in the end. And there, it wasn't time to bicker about things when you needed to get things done and survive. And so Churchill, being the leader of the Conservative Party, spent, and this is history looking back on the situation, Churchill spent more of his time being the leader of the nation and more focused on the war effort, so didn't spend as much time politicking, as you might say. He wasn't as focused on the next election as Labour could be, being that they were still helping in the war effort, but they weren't leading the nation, and so they could still act like a political party. And so they were able to, use not so much the war effort, because that was what was popular, but they were pointing backwards a little bit, saying, you know what, it was the Conservatives, at least Churchill getting the job, it was the Conservatives that were appeasing Hitler leading up to the war. So that, those, idiots that were doing that kind of thing. Or it was the 1930s were, terrible years, and the Conservatives were in charge for a good bit of that. So, you should lay the blame there for all the, misery of the 30s. And so, that had some effect. But even more so, people were really just ready for a change. After being in war so long, people are, they were just ready for something different, really. And so, with some of the new ideas that are out there that labor's pushing, people are amenable to making those changes, and we'll talk about that here some tonight. One of those, and probably the biggest, this is the genesis for what we're here talking about here tonight, and that's why I mentioned it, even though it sounds rather dull, just looking at the title here and everything. But in Britain, things tend to be very stoic, and so this was William Beveridge. Later became Lord Beveridge, Beveridge. This was 1942. So this is a report that was commissioned by the Churchill government. They were asking. Basically, he was a statistician, a academic, and they asked him to put together some ideas, a report on how the various Social Security schemes. They use the word schemes a lot in Britain. That doesn't mean like I'm going to plot to take away your money, through spam phone calls kind of scheme, but schemes meaning a plan and something that everyone buys into to benefit everyone else. That tends to be the way, or one way that scheme is used in Britain. And so the various Social Security schemes, so taking care of old people or helping the destitute, how those could be harmonized. And what Beveridge ended up doing was really pushing a good ways beyond his mandate. I haven't actually looked at if he's written like after the fact, years on, what he was thinking in doing this. But the general consensus is, looking at his work, he looked at all these schemes and said, we really need a full system rather than just having this scheme and that scheme and trying to make them all work. We need a solid plan that goes from beginning to end. And so that's what he did. He's the Social Insurance and Allied Services report here, and basically this is in a lot of ways, a sort of a manifesto. He said this is the best that we could do for our country, and said that basically it was social reform, looking at Social Security, creating a national health service, working towards full employment, making that just part of life, caused a real stir, and that people didn't have a lot of time to really mull on it at the time, because it was, we're in the middle of the war, and we don't have time to be worrying about how we're going to reshape society once the war is over, because we're still a long way off from that. But it will define a lot of political discourse in the post-war era. Labor, for their part, is going to be looking at this going, this guy had some really good ideas. And, there's some ideas that had been out there previously, but they said, I think we're just going to take this and run with it. And that's basically what they did. They pushed for adopting the report as policy, because, labor tends to lean more left leans toward more social services, and so that's what this focused on, was social services of all sorts. And they were able, at the same time, because conservatives' natural reaction would be, how are we going to pay for this, realistically, and maybe we should implement parts of it, or, they have those kind of discussions. They were able to paint conservatives as obstructing progress in a time when people were ready for change. So it was a sort of a double whammy kind of thing that they were able to benefit from here. Odd thing was that as a younger politician, Churchill was actually a reformer. He worked with Beveridge at one point, creating labor exchanges. He had been more of a liberal and social reformer, and had shifted toward the conservative side over time, but it is interesting that that was what he came out of, given that what we're going into here. So they, there was sort of a missed opportunity there, given the mood of the nation, that the conservatives could have, and you could always say the nation would have gone a different direction anyway, but they could have run with this. There was their government that pushed for this report to be done, and so that's just the way that it played out. But they chose to focus on the war, missed that particular opportunity. And so we're changing gears. So the war ends May 8th, 1945. The political coalition ended on May 23rd, 1945. The election was held in July. So beginning of May, end of May. We have the war in Europe ending, and the political coalition in Britain ending out, wasn't needed anymore in late May 1945. And then so you have all of June as sort of a campaign month, essentially. And then the election is held on July 5th, 1945. So there were still a lot of British servicemen abroad, so the counting lasted longer than would be normal. I think it lasted about 20 days. It took until July 25th for all the votes to be counted. But once that happens, this is the newspaper, Friday, July 27th, 1945, the Daily Herald. You have Labor winning very handily in this particular election. Labor in power, night climax to the great landslide, palace drama, London's bonfires were dancing. Attlee, the new prime minister, accepts the premiership, now forming government, which means choosing ministers for various positions within the government. And so it was a real shocker. This the big headline here on the 27th of July 27, 1945. And this was the election. So you see the three parties, obviously the two big ones, and then the Liberal Party, and then a couple of others that get thrown in. But Labor 47.7 to Conservatives 36.2, and Liberals taking 9%. And in any political contest, that's a pretty solid landslide there. You don't expect 60 or 70% in modern elections by any means. But that's the situation. So the Beveridge Report, we'll talk about what it meant, what it said, and then kind of how it got implemented, and then we'll get on toward the NHS in particular, because that's the one that people tend to think about the most, and so that's where we'll head with this. I think since we're getting to the end of this segment, I'll pause there, and we'll be back in just a second.